Welcome to EPG Pathshala for the course on History and Ideologies of Social Work. My name is Murli Desai and I'm a former professor of social work from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Today's topic is Western history of social work profession, which flows from the last three modules that we discussed, which are on Western ideologies of modern period. In this module today, we will look at the organized and scientific charity phase in England and United States, which ultimately led to the beginning of social work education. And then we will move on to see professionalization of Western social work. Okay, let's start about overall from where are ideologies coming to social work. Ideologies of social work at any point of history are influenced by the ideologies of social change of that time. Thus, all religions have promoted charity, liberalism has promoted freedom and welfare, socialism has promoted equality and meeting of basic needs. All these religious and secular ideologies have influenced social work profession. Now let's move further. The specific modern ideologies that influence the attributes of social work profession are as follows. Secular humanism led to secularization of help. Rationalism and scientism resulted in the importance of empirical knowledge base for social work, which has to be imparted through formal education. Specialization was an outcome of further progress in knowledge. Individualism led to individual-based diagnosis as well as treatment called casework. The liberal ideology helped the profession achieve support from the corporate sector. And the welfare orientation of the profession was suitable to the functioning of the nation state. So after having a bird's eye view of what ideologies led to social work profession, let's go a little more into detail of what is called organized and scientific charity. If you remember that there was a plea for organized and scientific charity from the rationalists as well as the liberalists. The liberalist ideology had brought a shift from state-sponsored welfare to organized voluntary charity. In 1834, the new poor law was enacted where public assistance was not considered a right and government was not responsible for employment. In the latter half of the 19th century, there was a growing realization that charity needs to be organized to reduce cost and made scientific or secular and humanitarian instead of religion-based. Two types of organized scientific charity approaches developed. One was charity organization society and the second one was settlement houses. A third important trend that contributed to development of social work profession was the National Conference of Charities and Corrections, which was initiated in the US in 1874 to bring attention to the organization and management of state and local custodial institutions, voluntary charity and other philanthropic agencies. Now, scientific charity was based in secular humanism and rationalism. And by scientific is meant that helpers should base their efforts on the facts of the situation. Like I said last time, it's not just important that you want to do something good. You should know with whom you are doing this, what is the situation, and therefore what kind of help is necessary. So this is what the scientists said, that you must know the facts of the situation or the person you're helping so that your helping can be rational with a clear idea of means and ends. It also accepted social Darwinism as an ideological base for its activities because the goal was moral improvement and regulation of the disorganized. Again, a very condescending attitude towards those who needed help and a very superior perception of those who are providing the help. Now let's see how the charity organization societies were different from the settlement houses. We'll call the former COS. The COS is considered friendly visit a substitute of alms and became a major model for dealing with the urban poor. According to the visitors, the poor's unfortunate and lowly condition resulted from deviations from middle class values such as temperance, industriousness, family cohesiveness, frugality, foresight, and moral restraint. The COSs therefore stressed imparting religious values. A major goal was to save the miserable from the sins of poverty. The main principles of the COSs were detailed investigation of the applicant, close cooperation between various relief agencies under a board of their representatives, and extensive use of voluntary workers for family visits. The duties of the friendly visitors in a district were to visit those in indigent circumstances who advise them with respect to their businesses, education of their children, and economy of their housing. Second, administer encouragement or admonition. And third, necessities were provided in small amounts, just enough to meet the immediate needs. The relation between the visitor and the client may have been personal but not friendly. The visitors saw in their clients less an equal or potential equal than an object of character reformation. And if you have noticed by now, the COSs finally gave shape to casework. These were the forerunners of the modern casework method. Now let's look at the settlement houses. The functioning of the settlement houses stood in contrast to that of the COSs. Staff members were linked to the community because they lived there. Rather than provide charity, they sought to help the communities of immigrants with all their problems in a geographic area. They used persuasion to get local politicians to provide basic services to the areas they served. They used group work, community organization, and advocacy methods to attend to working conditions and economic reforms. What were the implications of these two forms of organized and scientific charity? One, scientific charity found little support among rural townspeople, who were likely to regard the plight of the urban poor as punishment for sin, rum, and Roman Catholicism that they criticized. The big city poor people were likely to affirm traditional and sentimental charity as a sign of goodwill. Shopkeepers and skilled workers were likely to look to politics or unions as a solution to their problems and not to these two systems. The majority of the urban business and potential class was likely to be complacent, or if concerned, they were likely to support doctrinaire social Darwinists or socialists who seemed to get the root of the problems. It was this group of urban business and professional class who felt the importance of empirical knowledge and formal education for the functionaries of COSs and settlement houses for imparting knowledge. Finally, it was this group that was responsible for establishment of schools of social work. Okay, let's see how social work education began. Because education is considered, formal education is considered the beginning of any profession. Social work education in the US emerged from three parallel and related institutional developments during the latter half of the 19th century. One, development of social science as academic disciplines. Two, establishment of the National Conference of Charities and Corrections. And three, establishment of privately sponsored women's colleges and co-educational public universities. So these three systems which were taking shape were important for beginning of social work education. Mary Richmond at one of the conferences meetings made a compelling plea for a training school in applied philanthropy at the 1897 meeting of the National Conference of Charities and Corrections. Under her leadership, The New York COS established the first school of social work called the Summer School of Philanthropic Work, later to become the Columbia University School of Social Work, which began as a 6-week summer school. The first full-scale school of social work, however, was established in Amsterdam in 1899. The turn of the century marked a perceptible shift from secularization of welfare, which de-emphasized the connection to charity. The formal education was scientific and charity was not scientific. So charity was being replaced by the term social welfare, which was considered larger, wider, and more relevant. Friendly visitors, the term friendly visitors was replaced by social workers, and philanthropy was replaced by social work at the turn of the century. In time, social welfare came to refer to agencies and programs, and social work to the occupation in such agencies. In 1910, professional education programs were firmly established in several European and North American countries. The Western welfare states were responsible for the well-being of its citizens, and social work became part of state provision in these countries. Now let's look at what is profession and what is professionalization, and how Western social work got professionalized. There's a lot of literature on what are professional attributes or what makes a profession. Whereas with reference to social work, in 1915, a sociologist, Abraham Flexner, wrote a paper, presented it to say that social work is not a profession. He gave the following reasons for this conclusion. One is it does not have a knowledge base. Two, it is a mediating and not an original agency. Dealing with a time-limited phenomenon, to say that once that problem is over, you don't need social work anymore. And third, it does not have communicable techniques. In order to have formal education on social work, your techniques for social work intervention should be communicable through that education system. Now, Flexner saw social work as essentially a time-limited phenomenon, filling temporarily the interstices between and among other professions, until they assumed the tasks performed by social workers as a part of their own responsibility. For example, medical social work. So if the doctors and the health system can take care of those problems, you don't need medical social workers. Further development of thinking on professions and attributes of a profession, people realize that these are not fixed but rather evolving as society's need for definition of professions change in response to changing social conditions and values. That professionalism is not an either-or phenomenon. The attributes of a profession constitute a continuum, and professionalism may be viewed as a scale. So you can say, with reference to knowledge, social work is professionalized to this extent. You cannot say it is not a profession because the knowledge base is incomplete. So there's a continuum that is found useful. So the term uses professionalization of social work rather than whether it is a profession or not. Because professionalization is the degree to which an individual possesses and utilizes knowledge, skills and qualifications of a profession and others to its values and ethics when serving the client. Now, what are these attributes of a profession on which we can see professionalization or the degree of professionalization? Again, from a lot of literature, we find these three aspects very relevant and useful to understand social work profession. These are cognitive, monopolistic, and normative attributes. Cognitive, as the term indicates, has to do with the knowledge base, which would include a systematic body of theories and knowledge, formal education in universities to impart this knowledge, And growth in specialization was found to be an important indicator of professionalization in other disciplines, in other professions, so also in social work. The normative attributes comprise a code of ethical standard with an enforcement mechanism and professional associations, both of which play the regulatory role for social work profession and the professionals. The third aspect, which is monopolistic meaning that only we can do this and you can't. So professional authority, that we are the experts in this area, only we can do it. And sanction from the society, for the society to say, yes, only you can do it. Okay? Now, pursuit for professionalism led social workers to work hard for a scientific knowledge base and specialized skills, techniques and functions, because code of ethics, associations, monopoly, these developed on the strength of that knowledge base. Okay, values and ethics, an important regulatory aspect of any profession. In social work, what was happening? When social work practice and education began formally in the US in the late 19th century, practitioners paid more attention to the values and morality of the clients, as we saw earlier, that they were deviants, that they did not have good characters, that they required advices, they required character reformation. There was no concept of values and ethics of the profession to start with. This changed in as late as 1960, when the first code of ethics was developed by the National Association of Social Workers in the US. And it is this code of ethics that started talking about the practitioners' ethics in working with the people. The current stage, of course, with reference to code of ethics is much more advanced, where a lot more details have been developed with reference to making sure that people's rights are protected. The next aspect for any profession are the professional associations that regulate them. With reference to social work professional associations in the United States, which had taken over the dominant role from England with reference to social work profession. Two major associations. One is the Council on Social Work Education, set up in 1952, was an important body that set standards for undergraduate and graduate social work education institutions. Till today, it's an important body that carries out this particular activity. All states with social work licensing require applicants to be graduates of schools accredited by Council of Social Work Education. In 1955, the second body was set up in the United States, the National Association of Social Workers, which was a merger of 7 organizations. Before this NSW was set up, there was a separate association for casework and separate association for work with children. All these were merged into a National Association of Social Workers, which is a body that is regulating the profession, which includes education and practice, compared to CSWE, which looks at only the education. Social work literature, which is provides a knowledge base for social work, in the United States has made remarkable progress in strengthening its knowledge base. The growth of social work journals reflect both the increasing specialization and the centrality of knowledge development, dissemination, and utilization in the profession. Substantive application of theories, hypotheses, and findings from other disciplines to social work practice and social work policy is being carried out. Social work research has made important methodological gains. So this is beginning of professionalization of social work with reference to the major attributes. Now, in conclusion, let us look at the issues and the critique of Western social work profession. The strengths of Western professional social work often became its limitations. Secularization of help led to homogenization of problems, devoid of its family and community context. Everyone was considered same, no reference to religion, ethnicity, regional affiliation. So it kind of homogenized, which led to more individualism. The individual-based diagnosis as well as treatment also isolated individuals from their family and community context. Specializations in social work led to fragmentation of problems that resulted in focus upon symptoms and not the causes. The professionalization process often leads to a narrowing of the definition of the problem to be solved, because you do so much study, you go so much in depth, and then you find most appropriate situation, most perfect assessment of the problem, which is so minute that loses out on the context. So it also resulted in blaming of the victims, that this person has this problem because of this history, this background, this action, these choices that the person made. So blaming of the victims and prevented them from revolting, again a major criticism of the profession by others. Professionalization also led to issues with reference to social work being carried out by non-professionals, which is the monopoly aspect, and absence of interaction with social movements, which also looked at the issues of inequality and poverty. So with similar goals, social work still did not interact with the movements. Let's go into a little more details on these two aspects. One is professional social work versus non-professional social work. In forging its early alliance with a scientific model of knowledge building, social work was gradually pulled away from its value moorings. The profession paid a price for gaining access to the universities by having to accept the positivist epistemology of practice, which is today criticized for not being people-friendly. In doing so, they accepted that university-based scientists and scholars would create the fundamental theory which professionals would apply to practice. So a new hierarchy of educators versus the practitioners had emerged. People who were poor or sick became objects whose knowledge of their own experience was no longer valid. So experts who would decide what is wrong with them. The linkage to science created a new class of professionals and a counterpart class of clients. This has been inconsistent with social work value of belief in people's capacity and growth and the ability to direct the course of their own lives. The second issue of professional social work versus social movements, historically there's an unstated premise in professional social work that the social worker is working on behalf of the society, establishment. And this is evident from the fact that in the first quarter of the 20th century, social work in the West had allowed the major movements such as the labor movement, the black movement, and women's suffrage movement to pass by without any interaction with them. Professional social work and social movements both aim at amelioration of social problems. However, there are vast differences in their approaches. Social movements are intuitive and commitment-based, but PSW is the short form that we will use for professional social work, is based on formal and scientific education. Social movements have their source in religious ideologies or modern, postmodern, newer ideologies, whereas PSW has its direct source in Western, modern, secular ideologies. While social movements analyze the social issues in their historical context, PSW deals with social problems based on immediate needs. Social movements work towards changing the established order, whereas PSW works on behalf of the establishment. The former is therefore political and the latter apolitical. Social movements have historically led to major social changes, while PSW has made marginal changes in individuals, groups, and communities. Those in the movements have noted the PSW's capacity to reproduce oppressive social relations under the guise of providing care, a major criticism. Further critique of social work profession is that professionalism is an ideological bulwark against egalitarianism, unionism, and class struggle. By creating allegiance to the agency rather than to people in need, and by downplaying issues of hierarchy and class division, the professional model depoliticizes social work and retards social workers' ability to engage in political struggle and movements. Left-wingers have criticized it for imposing bureaucratic forms of social control upon poor people living in working class communities and being an oppressive part of the nation state. As we saw earlier, countries where there are welfare states, that's the developed countries, require professional social workers to work with the systems to provide the welfare provisions. The professional approach was suitable to the capitalists and the nation state, and therefore they both supported the profession. It offers individual resources, immunities, privileges, and autonomy to the professional social workers. As a result, social workers became the newer elite and professionalism became an end in itself. So it has not remained a calling embodying altruism, but an interest group concerned with professional perquisites, rewards, esteems, and influence. End here for this module on a negative note for the profession. However, the changing paradigm of social work also we will talk about as they followed the changing ideologies of social change. So this all for today's class. We saw the links between liberalism and scientism to organize and scientific charity, and this approach comprised charity organizations, societies, and settlement houses. And in this context, social work education began with empirical knowledge base and formal education of the functionaries. So more later with other modules, keep track of the story with interest and with linkages to what you are seeing as professional social work today. Thank you.